I just want the space to communicate. And one of the things that is less and less available in our society is space to communicate. And that's also happening to us as a culture. It's just impossible for a culture to adjust to the rapidity of change that's going on technologically. So that we don't have time to absorb, integrate, and process what's going on. And that's part of the problem that we're facing as healthcare givers, as educators, as health workers, as parents, and certainly as children growing up in this society. Well, my subject is the emotional basis of cognition. Cognition is actually something that rests on an edifice of emotion. So that the basis of learning and cognition is actually our emotional being. And that emotional being is very much connected to our visceral states, the states of our liver, of our stomach, of our heart, of our lungs, of our internal organs. And that the mind itself and the brain itself is an organizational entity that brings together information that's coming at it from the outside and from the inside at the same time. And in fact, the brain receives many more messages from the inside of the body than sometimes it does from the outside. And the messages that it receives from the inside has a lot to do with how well we can engage the external world. So that means our capacity to pay attention and to learn have a lot to do with what's happening internally on the visceral and emotional level and what our gut feelings are telling us. And so in a society where people are less and less connected to their gut feelings, there's less and less engagement with the realities of the external world. Even though we're externally focused, we are externally focused in a less efficient manner because of that disconnect. In other words, there's something about gut-level cognition that is absolutely valid and we ignore it at our peril. But that's a function of living in a society that actually cuts us off from our gut feelings. So that there's something internal that knows that is much stronger than what intellect is telling us. In any contest between the internal knowledge and the intellectual knowledge, 99% of the time, that internal knowing will be accurate. And the intellectual rationalization will be inaccurate. Now, what is the situation in North America? The situation is that we have millions of children being diagnosed with this, that, and the other. And my profession is really good at creating new diagnoses. So every time a DSM comes out, there's a whole bunch of new diagnoses in it with which you can label people now. So I'll give you one example. A common one is ADHD these days, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In the United States, according to the latest figures, there's at least 3 million kids who are receiving stimulant medications for ADHD. In Canada, the number of prescriptions for stimulant medications has gone up 43% in the last 5 years. Let alone the hundreds of thousands of kids who are receiving antipsychotic medications. Not to control psychosis, which they don't have, but to control what? To control their behaviors. And we don't even know what the long-term effects are of antipsychotics on the developing human brain. The early indications are nothing positive. So what we've got here is a massive social experiment in the chemical control of children's brains. Because we don't know what else to do. And so when children don't learn the way they do, the way we expect them to, and they don't behave the way we expect them to, we have two dominant responses. The one response is to medicalize it. Let's call it a medical name and let's medicate it. And by the way, as a physician, I'm not against medications. I've taken them, I've prescribed them. This is not a rant against medications. But I'm talking about the limitations of the medical approach, and I'm talking about the overwhelming domination of pharmacological approaches to childhood issues. So there's that response, the medical approach, and then there is the behavioral approach. And the behavioral approach says what's wrong here is the behavior itself. So let's fix and control the behavior. And that dominates psychology these days, behavioral approaches. So the problem is the behavior. So when a child is acting out, let's control the behavior. And parenting books will tell you, when the kid is doing this, the parent should do that. The child acts out, and the parents then should have some way of managing that acting out. But here's the thing about acting out. Look at the phrase itself. It's a good English phrase. It has a very specific meaning. We act out, and it doesn't mean that we're behaving badly. We act out when we don't have the language to say something in words. That's what acting out actually means. So in a game of charades, where you're not allowed to speak, you have to act out to deliver your message. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language, and you had to portray hunger, you'd have to act out. Kids are acting out all the time. And our response is to control the behavior. We respond to the form of the message rather than to the content of it. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. Now, in a Toronto school 3 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, there was a 9-year-old boy who ended up in handcuffs because the cops were called. And what happened was that this kid had, I think, Asperger's, one of these diagnoses, which is involves poor social processing and poor impulse control, amongst other features. And this kid had been bullied, and he was very upset. He was screaming. I don't know what he was doing. The teachers, in their wisdom, decided that what he needed was to be isolated. And how often we do that to kids? We isolate them. Well, he was put in a room by himself, at which point he really freaked out. And neurophysiologically, he needed something very, very different. But what they did is isolated him, at which point he started throwing things and I think destroying the furniture, and that's where they called the police. And the police handcuffed this 9-year-old. And the debate afterwards was, was the police right to handcuff the kid? But that wasn't the right question. When you call the police, they're going to do what the police do, which is to restrain. That's what they're trained to do. The real question was, how come that well-meaning, and I assume well-educated teachers in a major school system had no understanding that what that child needed at that moment was emotional closeness with a nurturing adult to regulate his neurophysiology. That's what needed at that moment. And these incidents are not totally isolated. I mean, handcuffing is isolated, but it was in British Columbia here 8 or 9 years ago. There was a case of a hyperactive kid in an elementary school. The teacher dealt with it by taping his head to the bench, to his desk. This is how she learned to control his hyperactivity. Now, there's another way to understand all this, which is that these behaviors rest on an emotional edifice, and when the behaviors are not such as meet our standards or expectations and don't serve the child, we actually have to ask ourselves, what is happening for that child emotionally at that moment? Now, and let's face it, there's many, many more kids who are having behavior problems, impulse regulation problems, body regulation problems, emotional outbursts, difficulties learning. This is burgeoning in our society. But the question is why? Is it because some genetic disease is somehow mysteriously spreading in the population? Or something is happening in children's lives that is undermining their capacity to socially interact well, to pay heed, to pay attention, to be emotionally regulated, to have impulse regulation, to be able to regulate their stresses? Now, the prefrontal cortex, you've been hearing about the brain today, I'm sure, and the prefrontal cortex has 9 very important functions. It regulates the body itself, the prefrontal cortex being the mammalian cortex, the one that's latest to develop evolutionary speaking. And it really is what distinguishes us from other animals. It regulates the body. It regulates attuned communication with others. It is responsible for emotional balance. It allows us response flexibility. So response flexibility means that if you say something to me that might upset me, then instead of reacting by screaming back at you, I can actually say, oh, okay, what's happening for you that you said that to me, and do I really have to take it personally? And then I can respond rather than react. Providing insight, providing empathy, the modulation of fear, so that when something happens, then the fear circuits in the brain start taking over. Something in the prefrontal cortex will override that fear circuit, saying, okay, calm down, you can actually handle this. Intuition and morality. 9 of these modalities, these 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex, are actually supported by mindful awareness practice. And 7 of them at least, and here's the key, are supported and developed by nurturing parenting. And I think all 9 of them are. Because what we're actually coming down to in our society, and the reason that so many children are having so many problems, is for no other cause but that the parenting environment has become so stressed, so that parents are no longer able to provide their children with the environment that these functions and the prefrontal circuits that serve these functions can develop properly. That's why the epidemic. It's not bad parenting. It's not the drinking water. It's not some genetic disease that's spreading. What's going on is that the conditions for healthy brain development of the prefrontal cortex are less and less available for children. Let me turn now to an article that appeared in the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Association. And it summed up very nicely the accumulated knowledge of the past several decades. And the article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And they say, growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, and I stress the word stress here, or instability, can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the things that young human beings have to develop as adaptive mechanisms to survive early stress will help them endure that early stress, but in the long term will interfere with health and learning, adaptation, social relationships, and even longevity.